Lose that cheap expression. You are nothing but a servant. Victor Hale's voice cut through the glittering banquet hall, sharp as glass. The waiter froze, the tray shaking in his hands, while jeweled guests turned to stare. A cruel ripple of laughter spread beneath the chandeliers, echoing against the marble walls. His knuckles tightened around the silver as the music played on, masking the humiliation. If you stood in his place, would you bow your head or fight back? Victor Hale was 52 years old, a man who believed that the world itself bent to his command. Whenever he stepped into a room, conversations hushed, laughter softened, and every eye instinctively turned toward him. He had built an empire from the wealth of his family, expanding it into global ventures, and he wore power like a second skin. He had perfected the art of the polished smile, the kind that suggested generosity, but behind it lived a man who regarded most people as tools to be used and discarded. The banquet that evening was meant to display his triumph. The marble floor reflected chandeliers that spilled white light over tables draped in silk. Rows of crystal glasses sparkled under the glow, and plates of delicacies waited to be touched by forks of silver. The room was filled with the hum of elite conversation, the fragrance of expensive perfume, and the sound of an orchestra placed carefully in the corner. For Victor, every detail was designed to remind his guests of his dominance. The banquet was not a celebration, it was a performance of superiority. Among the servers who moved like shadows was Daniel, a 23-year-old waiter whose presence went largely unnoticed by the powerful men and women who filled the hall. He carried himself with quiet discipline. Every glass on his tray was balanced with care, every step measured to avoid drawing attention. Yet within his eyes, there was a depth that told of hardship and resilience. He was not simply a servant. He was a young man who had learned early in life that dignity had to be defended in silence. Daniel had been working double shifts for months to cover his mother's medical bills. His father had died years earlier, a factory worker who left little behind, except memories of long hours and quiet sacrifices. Daniel had grown up in the narrow back streets of the city, where noise, hunger, and debt pressed on every corner. To survive meant swallowing pride, bowing to insults, and finding strength in small victories. Tonight he wore a uniform that blurred him into the background, but his mind recorded every detail of the glittering world around him. The insult delivered by Victor earlier in the evening had burned into his chest like a brand. It was not the first time someone had looked down on him, but rarely had the cruelty been so public. Guests turned their heads, some smirking behind raised glasses, others pretending not to notice. The orchestra continued to play, as if music could erase the sting of humiliation. Daniel forced his hands to remain steady, even as shame and anger fought inside him. He could feel every beat of his heart echoing in his ears. Victor, meanwhile, sat at the center table like a monarch among courtiers. He raised his glass and smiled, as if the incident had been nothing more than entertainment. His life had never known the weight of real struggle. Born into privilege, he had been taught from childhood that respect was his birthright. He collected art, estates, and corporations, and he collected people in much the same way. To him, the staff who served him were invisible. They existed only to affirm his importance. Each insult he spoke fed his vanity. Each nervous laugh from those around him confirmed his authority. Daniel remembered his mother's words in moments like this. She had told him never to let the cruelty of others define his worth. Yet he also remembered his father's silence, the kind that swallowed dignity until nothing was left. He did not want to inherit that silence. He wanted proof, something undeniable that could expose the truth of men like Victor. And so his hand brushed the phone in his pocket, its recording function running since the start of the evening. What had begun as a simple habit of keeping notes during long shifts had suddenly transformed into something else. Now it was a weapon, small and invisible, but powerful enough to shift the balance. As Daniel moved between tables, pouring wine and clearing plates, the humiliation lingered. It clung to him like smoke that would not lift. Every time he passed close to Victor, he could feel the billionaire's eyes on him, still carrying that mocking smirk. For the guests, the moment had already been forgotten. For Daniel, it was carved deep inside. He wondered how many others in the room had endured the same, but stayed silent because they feared the consequences. The thought only strengthened his resolve. Victor raised his glass once more. His voice boomed across the marble hall, confident and commanding. "To power," he declared, savoring the echo of his own words. The guests raised theirs in unison, crystal chiming in a chorus of loyalty. At the far end of the hall, Daniel lowered his head and bowed slightly, but inside he felt something shift. The humiliation had planted a seed of defiance, and that seed was beginning to take root. The tension that had been planted in the opening moments of the banquet refused to fade. Victor Hale, satisfied with the laughter that followed his insult, leaned back in his chair as if nothing had happened. To him, the evening was unfolding perfectly. He had humiliated someone powerless and received a chorus of approving chuckles from those too timid to challenge him. For Victor, this was power, visible and unquestioned. But for Daniel, the waiter who had borne the words, the insult remained like a wound, pressed raw with every passing second. He continued to serve wine and clear plates, but his ears caught fragments of whispered conversations. Some guests smirked, recalling Victor's sneer, while others avoided looking at him altogether. The humiliation replayed in his mind in an endless loop, sharper than the violin notes spilling across the room. At one point, Daniel returned to the main table to refill glasses. As he leaned slightly, Victor smirked and said just loud enough for the nearest guests to hear, "Careful, boy. That bottle costs more than your life." The surrounding men chuckled, lifting their glasses. Daniel's jaw tightened, his eyes fixed on the steady stream of red wine as he poured. He said nothing, but inside the weight of silence pressed harder than ever. Victor delighted in such moments. He lived for them. The more invisible the servant, the more satisfying the sting of his words. He enjoyed drawing boundaries, separating himself from those beneath him. It was a ritual that reaffirmed his sense of superiority. He could not imagine that in Daniel's pocket, his every word was being recorded in perfect clarity. Guests tried to ignore the discomfort. Some women exchanged quick glances, their smiles brittle. A man shifted in his chair, but he said nothing. The balance of the room remained tipped in Victor's favor. To challenge him was to risk exile from his empire of influence. So they raised their glasses and pretended the insult had evaporated, but the air had grown heavier. Daniel's mind raced. His mother's face appeared in his thoughts, pale from sickness, yet filled with dignity. She had always told him that silence was not weakness if it preserved his strength for the right moment. He wondered now if this was that moment. His thumb brushed the side of his phone, checking without looking that the recording continued. Each cruel word, each mocking laugh became part of a growing ledger of truth. As the night deepened, the speeches began. Victor rose to address the hall, his voice carrying with practiced authority. He spoke of expansion, of vision, of his commitment to progress. Applause followed each declaration, but Daniel heard only the hypocrisy vibrating in every syllable. The man who spoke of leadership and respect had just stripped another man of dignity for sport. Daniel's stomach tightened, his hands clenched, but he moved with professional grace. The initial conflict was no longer a single insult. It had become a widening fracture in the night's performance. Guests sensed it, even if they dared not acknowledge it. The waiter, who should have been forgotten, had become a silent center of gravity. Victor had drawn all eyes toward him by attacking someone small, and in doing so, he had shifted the spotlight without realizing it. When Daniel approached the table once more, Victor glanced at him with narrowed eyes, searching for defiance. "Do not spill," he said, his voice casual but cutting. Daniel met his gaze for the briefest second, then lowered his eyes. That single flicker of contact was enough to fuel Victor's disdain. He chuckled, leaning toward the guest beside him. "See, they always know their place." Those words, preserved on the recording, were heavier than any glass lifted in the hall. They were the spark that turned a cruel remark into evidence. They transformed private arrogance into public ammunition. And though Victor basked in the glow of laughter, Daniel understood that the night had shifted. The music swelled once more, masking the undercurrent of unease. Conversations resumed, plates were cleared, and the orchestra played as if nothing had changed. But in truth, something had. For the first time, Daniel did not feel entirely powerless. The insult had been brutal, the humiliation sharp, yet it had given him something he had never held before: leverage. As he moved quietly among the guests, his mind sharpened with a new clarity. He was no longer simply enduring, he was waiting. The banquet pressed forward with a rhythm carefully orchestrated by Victor Hale's team. Toasts rose, music filled the air, and plates of food were exchanged in a seamless dance of luxury. Yet beneath the glittering surface a storm gathered. The insult had not died. It lingered, seeping through the cracks of conversation. Every glance at Daniel carried the memory of humiliation, and every smirk on Victor's face reminded him that the wound was still open. Daniel moved through the hall with the same precise steps he had mastered over years of service. His hands carried trays, his lips stayed silent, but his mind pulsed with thoughts he could not silence. The recording on his phone felt heavier with each passing moment. It was no longer a simple file. It was proof. And proof carried weight. He caught fragments of whispers. Two younger investors at a corner table murmured about Victor's cruelty. "Arrogant as always," one said, sipping champagne. "Still, profitable," the other replied, shrugging. Their words burned into Daniel's memory. They saw the arrogance, but dismissed it because money outweighed dignity. That realization struck him harder than the insult itself. Victor, meanwhile, reveled in his performance. Each time Daniel passed near, he found a new way to cut him down, with words disguised as jokes. "Do not trip, boy. The marble is worth more than your paycheck. Step back, you are blocking the view." Each remark was delivered casually, but the effect was sharp. Guests laughed politely, though the sound rang hollow. Victor mistook their discomfort for admiration. Daniel's chest tightened with every word. His silence became heavier, his restraint more difficult. He wanted to throw the tray down, to shout, to expose Victor in front of them all. But impulse would destroy him. He had no power in that room, except the recording still growing in his pocket. So he endured, every insult pressing deeper, knowing that with endurance came leverage. As the evening reached its midpoint, a moment of near disaster arrived. Daniel approached the center table with a bottle of wine. His hands were steady, but as he leaned forward, Victor suddenly shifted his chair, forcing Daniel to stumble. The tray jolted, and a single glass tipped, spilling wine across the polished table. Gasps echoed around them. Victor's eyes flashed with satisfaction. "Clumsy fool," he snapped, voice booming through the hall. "You cannot even carry a glass without failing." Laughter erupted again, though sharper this time, edged with unease. Daniel bowed quickly, murmuring an apology. Inside, his heart pounded like a drum. He thought the phone might have slipped, but when he touched his pocket, he felt its familiar weight. The recording was still safe. The incident rippled through the room. Guests whispered more openly now. Some looked at Victor with discomfort, others at Daniel with pity. The atmosphere had shifted from admiration to tension. The more Victor mocked, the more cracks appeared in the flawless image he tried to project. Later, in the hallway behind the banquet hall, Daniel paused for a moment to breathe. The silver tray rested against the wall, his hands trembling as he pressed them into his apron. He remembered his father's silence, his mother's warning not to let cruelty define him. He knew he could not remain invisible forever. Tonight had become something larger than humiliation. It was a test of whether he would continue in silence or find the courage to act. Meanwhile, inside the hall, Victor raised another toast. His words echoed with confidence, but the mask was thinning. A few guests avoided clapping, their expressions tight. One investor leaned to another and whispered, "If this leaks, it could damage everything." Victor did not hear them. He believed his throne was secure. Daniel returned to the hall with renewed focus, his face calm, his steps measured, yet every movement was driven by the knowledge that he held a weapon Victor could not see. The insults continued, but now each one felt less like a wound and more like ammunition. Every laugh, every sneer, every cruel remark carved itself into the recording. The tension escalated further when Victor called out across the hall, pointing at Daniel. "Do you see this boy? Proof that some men are born only to serve. No ambition, no worth, just hands carrying plates." The hall fell silent. Guests exchanged uneasy glances. Even those who had laughed earlier now shifted uncomfortably. Daniel felt his throat tighten, but he kept his eyes lowered. The phone in his pocket captured it all. By the time dessert was served, the hall was divided. Some guests whispered uneasily, others forced smiles, while Victor basked in what he thought was dominance. The truth was different. The more he spoke, the more he exposed himself. The banquet that had begun as a display of triumph had transformed into a stage for arrogance, and the audience was no longer amused. Daniel understood then that the night was no longer about survival. It was about truth. He carried the proof in his pocket, but the decision of what to do with it still loomed ahead. The insults had escalated. The humiliation deepened, and the stakes had grown far beyond a single moment of shame. The evening had become a battle of silence against power, and though no one yet knew it, the balance was about to shift. The banquet ended late, the orchestra's final notes fading as guests drifted out into the cool night. Victor Hale shook hands with investors, his smile fixed, his voice booming with confidence. To anyone watching, the evening looked like a flawless success. Yet beneath the polished surface, unease simmered. Some guests left with stiff expressions, others with hushed comments about arrogance. Victor dismissed it all. He believed power erased discomfort. Daniel moved quietly through the emptying hall, gathering glasses and folding linens. His body was exhausted, but his mind burned with the weight of what he carried in his pocket. Hours of cruelty, recorded without interruption. Every insult, every sneer, every mocking laugh was etched into that file. He had endured the night in silence, but the silence was now a weapon. Back in the service corridor, Daniel leaned against the wall and pressed play. Victor's voice filled the narrow space, sharp and unfiltered. The sound of laughter, the cruel tone, the words that cut like knives, it was all there. Daniel's hands trembled as he listened. He knew that what he held could not only defend his dignity, but could also strike at Victor's empire. The thought terrified him, but it also lit something fierce within him. The next morning, before Victor even rose from his bed, the first ripple appeared online. A short audio clip had surfaced on a small forum. Victor's voice, mocking, cruel, unmistakable. At first it seemed minor, the kind of leak that disappears quickly. But within hours, the recording spread. Social media picked it up, reshared by thousands. News outlets reached out for confirmation. The words were too distinct to deny. By midday, the banquet insult was no longer a private humiliation. It had become public spectacle. Hashtags trended, headlines multiplied, and Victor's name burned across every screen. Some dismissed it as rumor, but others demanded accountability. Investors watched closely, calculating risks. Victor's initial reaction was fury. He shouted at his staff, demanded to know who had betrayed him. He called it slander, insisted it was fabricated. But denial could not erase the clarity of his own voice, echoing across the internet. The more he fought, the more the recording spread. Daniel sat in his small apartment, phone in hand, watching the fire grow. He had not released the clip himself. He had only confided in one colleague, another waiter who had once endured the same humiliation. Somehow, the file had found its way into the world. Daniel's chest tightened with fear. He could lose his job, maybe worse. Yet deep inside, beneath the fear, was something new. Relief. The truth was no longer trapped in his pocket. It was alive, and it was unstoppable. Victor's empire had not yet fallen, but the cracks were spreading. The banquet meant to crown his triumph had become the beginning of his undoing. What had started as a private insult had erupted into a public reckoning, and for the first time in his life, Victor Hale could not control the narrative. The scandal unfolded with a speed that stunned even Victor Hale. By the second day, every major outlet had published the audio. Television anchors replayed his voice with captions that dripped with condemnation. Commentators dissected his words, branding him arrogant, abusive, unworthy of the power he flaunted. Overnight, the man who had once commanded admiration became a symbol of unchecked pride. Victor stormed through his penthouse, slamming doors, barking orders at his legal team. "Shut it down," he demanded. "Erase it." But influence that once bent rules now faltered under the weight of public outrage. Social media had turned into a courtroom, and in that courtroom, Victor was already guilty. The investors who had toasted him only nights earlier began to withdraw quietly. One by one, they issued statements of concern, distancing themselves from the man at the center of the storm. At his office headquarters, protests gathered. Employees who had once endured his harsh treatment now whispered to reporters, confirming the culture of disdain that reigned under his command. Former staff recounted stories of humiliation similar to what Daniel had faced. The narrative grew stronger, and the cracks in his empire deepened. Daniel watched it all unfold from a small cafe, eyes fixed on the glowing screen of his phone. He had gone to work as usual, but whispers followed him, some with pity, others with admiration. He was cautious, careful not to speak, yet he felt the tide shifting. For once, silence no longer felt like submission. Silence had become strength. Victor attempted to fight back. He called a press conference, standing before flashing cameras in a tailored suit. "The recording is manipulated," he declared, voice tight. "This is an attack on my reputation." But as he spoke, another clip surfaced online. Longer, clearer, undeniable. The words were his, dripping with cruelty, echoing across every device in the nation. Gasps spread through the room. Journalists shouted questions. Victor's denial collapsed in real time. The empire began to unravel. Contracts were suspended. Banks reviewed partnerships. The very deal he had celebrated at the banquet was withdrawn, the foreign investors citing ethical concerns. Stocks plummeted, his wealth shrinking by millions in a matter of days. The image of invincibility shattered. He raged in private, smashing a glass against the wall, his reflection fractured into shards. Meanwhile, Daniel's life shifted in ways he had never imagined. A journalist reached out anonymously, praising his courage. Online forums called him a quiet hero, though his name remained hidden. To the public, the waiter was faceless, but to those who knew the truth, he had become a symbol of defiance against arrogance. In the boardrooms of rival companies, discussions began. Leaders who had once feared Victor now spoke his name with disdain. One executive leaned back in his chair, watching the headlines scroll across the screen. "Find that waiter," he said to his assistant. "Someone who can stand against Hale with nothing but the truth deserves a place here." Victor, cornered and desperate, lashed out at those closest to him. He accused allies of betrayal, dismissed staff without reason, and threatened lawsuits against anyone who questioned him. But every move only fueled the fire. The world had shifted against him. His voice, once a weapon of command, had become evidence of his downfall. One night, Daniel walked past the towering headquarters, where Victor's name was etched in gold letters across the facade. Crowds gathered outside, holding signs, chanting slogans that demanded accountability. Daniel stood in the shadows, unnoticed, the glow of his phone lighting his face. For the first time, he felt no shame. The humiliation he had endured had transformed into vindication. He whispered to himself, barely audible, "You cannot erase the truth." Inside the building, Victor sat alone in his office, staring at the skyline that no longer felt like his kingdom. His phone buzzed endlessly with calls he refused to answer. On the desk lay newspapers with headlines that spelled his disgrace. He lifted a glass, but the whiskey inside did nothing to numb the reality. The empire he had built through fear and arrogance was crumbling, and he could not stop it. The true reversal had come not through a rival corporation, nor through politics, but through a single act of resistance by someone he had dismissed as worthless. The waiter he had mocked had become his undoing. Victor's laughter had once filled banquet halls. Now it echoed only in recordings, played by millions. A ghost of arrogance that would never be forgotten. And so the man who believed he could never be touched finally felt the weight of justice, not through courts or contracts, but through the power of truth unleashed. Victor Hale's empire collapsed faster than anyone had predicted. The board of directors, once loyal to his every command, convened an emergency meeting. By the end of the week, he was removed as CEO. The company issued a public statement denouncing his behavior, desperate to salvage what remained of their reputation. The golden letters of his name that had shone proudly at the top of the headquarters were quietly taken down. News cameras captured the moment Victor stepped out of the building for the last time. The once proud billionaire walked with his shoulders hunched, shielded by bodyguards, as crowds shouted his name with venom. Reporters swarmed him with questions about dignity and respect, but his silence was heavy. His arrogance had been stripped away, leaving nothing but the hollow shell of a man who thought himself untouchable. Investors who had once raised their glasses to him now turned their backs. Deals worth billions vanished overnight. Lavish parties dried up, and the invitations that had once flooded his calendar never came again. Victor Hale, who once lived on magazine covers, was reduced to whispers of disgrace. Meanwhile, Daniel's world shifted in a way he could hardly comprehend. He continued to work quietly, refusing to speak publicly. But word spread through private circles. Executives who admired integrity reached out. One day, he received a discreet letter from a prestigious corporation, offering him a position far above his role as a waiter. Not because of the recording itself, but because of the composure and resilience he had shown in the face of cruelty. For the first time, Daniel stepped into a building, not as a servant, but as a professional welcomed with respect. The polished floors no longer reflected his humiliation, but his dignity. Colleagues greeted him not as invisible, but as an equal. He carried himself with the same quiet discipline, but now his silence spoke of strength, not submission. The world had already begun to forget Victor Hale's rise, but it would never forget his fall. The recording lived on as a warning played in classrooms, boardrooms, and training sessions about ethics and leadership. His downfall became a case study of arrogance punished by truth. One evening, Daniel stood outside the same marble hall where it all began. The chandeliers still shone, the music still played, but the memory of that night no longer filled him with shame. Instead, it filled him with certainty. He had endured, he had carried the truth, and in the end, the truth had spoken louder than power. The fall of Victor Hale became more than the story of one man's arrogance. It became a mirror held up to society, a reminder that dignity cannot be bought, and that cruelty leaves scars deeper than wealth can hide. His fortune dwindled, his power evaporated, and yet the words he had spoken lived on, replayed endlessly as proof of what unchecked pride can destroy. For Daniel, the journey was not about revenge, but about truth. He never sought the spotlight, never boasted about what he carried in his pocket that night. He understood that the true strength was not in humiliation returned, but in refusing to bow when the world demanded silence. His quiet defiance turned into a voice louder than Victor's empire ever was. The lesson echoed long after the headlines faded. Respect is not a luxury, it is a right. To strip someone of their dignity is to strip yourself of your humanity. The banquet had been Victor's stage, but in the end, it was Daniel's resilience that defined the story. And so, the tale closed, not with wealth or ruin, but with a question that lingered in every heart. When faced with cruelty and injustice, would you turn away, or would you find the courage to press record and let the truth speak for itself?